Hello everyone and welcome to my first video. In this video, I will be discussing the appearance of the Kurds in ancient times. However, I will only focus on accounts in which the toponym or ethnonym used can be equated or linked with the Kurds. So what does this mean? Well, the Kurds in early Islamic times had a very extensive dispersion throughout Mesopotamia and the adjoining regions, and the term Kurd had become the primary term to refer to all these Indo-Iranian speaking tribes. Now, the big difference with ancient times is that back then there were still numerous other terms and tribal names circulating, most of which in time would disappear. It would thus appear that many of these tribes would, as it were, become Kurds shortly after the arrival of Islam. Note that I will use the term Iranic. This is a language family, and the speakers of these languages never were confined to just the present-day territory of Iran, nor did they all share the same identity. Compare it with Germanic, Latin, or Semitic languages. This video therefore is not quite sufficient if one wants to get a complete understanding of the Kurds or their ancestors in the ancient period, since many different tribes and religious communities contributed to the Kurdish ethnogenesis. The main purpose of this video is to present some little-known sources on the ancient period, as well as some findings on terms related to Kurd. Finally, I have to point out that to this day, there's much contention on this heavily politicized topic. The first question without a definite answer is whether the term Kurd is in fact descended from terms that predate the arrival of the Indo-Iranians in the Middle East around 1200 BC, or whether it does have an Indo-Iranian origin. There are, after all, a plethora of terms that could have been the source of the Kurdish ethnonym. Before moving on to the sources which are more often brought into connection with the Kurds, we may take into account the following examples. The land of Karda, as mentioned in Sumerian sources in the 3rd millennium BC. The Guti or Kuti people mentioned from the 3rd millennium BC throughout the entire ancient period, though it's generally assumed that past a certain point, Guti had become a generic term for mountain dwellers. They are mentioned in the 22nd century BC during the reign of Utuhigal, in the 18th century BC during the reign of Hammurabi, and in the 13th century BC as Kuti and even Kurti during the reign of Tukulti-Ninip I. In the 12th century BC during the reign of Naram-Sin, in the 11th century BC again as the Kurti people during the reign of Tiglath-Pileser I, in the 6th century BC during the reign of Namanites as Kuti, and even in the 2nd century BC during the reign of Mirdad II. Furthermore, there were various individuals called Kurti or Kurdi, such as a horse trainer and farmer from Nineveh and Assur respectively, as well as their namesakes being rulers of the towns of Tilkarimo, Shinichtu, and Atuna during the reign of Sargon II in the 8th century BC. Also, the Greek Hekataios of Miletus mentions the Gordi, a people dwelling near Lake Urmia, next to the Matieni people, in the 6th century BC. And various ancient writers also mention the Kardakas, though these are often presumed to have been a military unit, mentioned at least since the 4th century BC. So as you can see, terms that are very much alike Kurd have existed since ancient times. Often the origin is thought to be Semitic, signifying mountain or strong, though derivation from later Iranic terms is also considered, such as Gort, meaning brave, or Kurt, assumed to have meant semi-nomadic pastoralist or mountain dweller. It's also very possible that these terms have influenced each other. The two people that at present are deemed most likely to have been the eponymous and even partially the direct ancestors of the Kurds are the Carduchians and Kurtians, respectively first mentioned in the 5th and 3rd century BC. Let us first take a look at the Carduchians and their region called Gordyene. This primarily lay in what would later be called the Botan and Hakkari regions, with emphasis on the former. Here also stands the Kardu or Judi mountain, often thought to be the mountain on which Noah landed with his ark. This was already asserted in the Babyloniaca of Berosus and other ancient sources. This region is enclosed by the Tigris, Khabur, and Botan rivers and the Zagros mountains. The region of Gordyene, however, at times would include lands west of the Tigris, north of the Botan River, and others, including such regions as Muxuene, Tomorik, and parts of later Arzanin. Among its cities were Sarissa, Satalka, and notably Pinaka, in Islamic times known as Finik. Its key fortress was Bezabda, in the region of Zabdijen. Another fortress was Alki, still called as such in Kurdish today. They first pop up in the famous Anabasis by the Greek Xenophon in 401 BC, when they resisted the 10,000 as the Greek army retreated from a failed expedition against Persia, making their way through the mountains, heading for Armenia. The Greeks, Strabo and Pliny, insisted that the Carduchians of old should be equated with the Corduans of their era. Generally, it was described as a wealthy, well-cultivated land, also possessing hydrocarbon sources. The people made copper vessels, used huge bows, produced wine, kept cattle, and were known as master builders and siege engineers, being adept at mountain warfare. The country was also often occupied by Romans, Persians, and Armenians. They were generally mentioned quite separately from other peoples and at times had their own king. However, their language is unattested, and the cultural landscape of this region appears to have been heavily mixed. Among its Indo-Iranian influences are some personal names: Mare, Zarbianos, Manisar, Bakur, as well as the fact that the Zabdaeans made for great horse archers, at that time a typically Iranic feature. However, it appears that the Armenians also saw it as an authentic Armenian region. Its rulers were even to become part of the Armenian nobility, participated in pan-Armenian events, and there was Armenian Christian activity. On the other hand, here the Syriac Christian tradition was probably even stronger. There was, after all, a diocese for the Kardu region, and many of the individuals had Syriac or general Semitic names. Regarding the Greek and Roman influences, it was believed that Jason's companions during his hunt for the Golden Fleece were called Kurdus, Armenos, and Arbelos, granting their names to the areas in which they settled. There was also the partial Hellenization of the elites, and even possibly Greek colonies, as well as Roman army units. It has to be pointed out that Adiabene and Sophene, other kingdoms of northern Mesopotamia, had very recognizable Indo-Iranian elements, such as religious practices and Iranic personal names, but that is for another video. In any case, as the ancient period drew to its close, it becomes more and more apparent that though the toponym Kardu would persist, mention of the Korduans would cease. There are scholars who assert that there must have been a difference between Kurds and Carduchians, claiming that the term Kurd cannot be descended from Kardu, which may or may not be true. However, it does seem clear that in Aramaic at least, the Kurds also were referred to with terms that do appear descended from Kardu, for in that language they are called Kordoye, Kurdaye, and even Kartawaye. Though it's also possible that these are hybrid forms. The equation of the latter term, Kartawaye, with the Kurds comes from two Syriac authors in the Middle Ages, with bilingual works, Elias of Nisibis and Michael the Syrian. They used Akrat, meaning Kurds in the Arabic, for Kartawaye in the Syriac. This term appears to designate specifically the Kurds of the Cordovan region, and Syriac authors would even call this land Beth Kartawaye, or lands of the Kurds. They also refer to the city nowadays called Cizre as Gazarta de Kardawaye, previously called Gazarta de Kardu. To this, I have to add that the 12th century writer, Ibn Shaddad, noted that in the past, the same city that was called Jazira ibn Umar in his days was called Jazir al-Akrat in the past. Also in Arabic sources, we find the term Bilad al-Akrat for this region, again meaning lands of the Kurds. These Syriac terms, which also appear in Hebrew, were glossed by scholiasts in old manuscripts, who noted that these terms refer to inhabitants of the Kardu mountains. The first mention I could find are in the Acts of Marmari. Marmari lived in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, and the work was probably composed in the 5th century. In it is mentioned a military commander called Zaradosh, who had a son named Kardwai. Also in the work is mentioned a purely Kurmanji Kurdish word, Zozan, a place near Dasen and Gawar, where the people were converted to Christianity. Then, in the Book of Chasteté, one Marshalita of the 4th century established a convent in the lands of the Kurds and the Zabdaeans. Thereafter lived in the monastery of Apapakum, and finally went to live in Fanak. However, this region is also called Beth Zabdai and Qardu in other parts of the text. As a contemporary of the 5th century Mar Narsai is mentioned one Khatshaba Kardwaya, and among those who followed Hewai in the school of the Persians were Akak the Aramean, Barsauma, servant of Mari Kardwaya, as well as other people, among them also Indo-Iranians. In the legend of Mar Karda, presumably composed in the 6th or 7th century, we learn of an individual called Abdishul, who states, "As it was told to me by my parents, they were from Haza, a village in the lands of the Assyrians, but because they were Christians, they were driven out by impious pagans, and went and settled in Tamanum, a village in the lands of the Kurds." This land of the Kurds is also mentioned later in the work. When the Blessed One saw this, he rejoiced greatly and praised God. And they traveled by these markers until they arrived in the land of the Kurds. And he raised his eyes and looked, and behold, there were great camps of his enemies, pitched beside the Khabur River. His enemies here being Roman raiders, by the way. Though I cannot verify, I reckon the term Beth Kartawaye was used in the original. In the Persian Martyr Acts in Syriac, we find the story of the 5th century Saba Guznazdat, the so-called converter of heathens. He was from the village of Beth Kalal, close to the Diyala River, perhaps today's Julala or Gulala, born in the Parthian house of Mihran, a Magi or Zoroastrian family. However, he converted to Christianity and spent most of the rest of his life converting the many pagan groups in Beth Lashpar, Beth Karmai, and Sharazor, and founding churches and convents. One day he went up into the mountains along with Beth Sharik and was captured by Kurds. These Kurds worshipped the sun. Beth Sharik preached against the sun worship of the Kurds, while Sabah instead equated God with the sun. Meanwhile, the daughter of the Kurdish tribal chief was possessed by an evil spirit. Sabha then successfully performed an exorcism on the girl, whereupon the Kurds converted to Christianity. The evil spirit is said to have then taken the form of a black snake. The same work also mentions one Rabban Jacobus from the 6th century, who cursed the rising of the Kurds in Beth Kardu, for which the term Beth Karut is used instead. Also, in the 5th century, in a list of bishopric sees of the Assyrian Church, we find one Adrak, bishop of the 10th of the Kurds. And down south, in Persia, in 424, a bishopric see called Maskena de Kurdu, or Camps of the Kurds, is mentioned. Also, there's a 5th century Babylonian Talmud, which makes a peculiar distinction between Kartuans and Karduans. The former could become Jews, the latter not. Intuitively, one might suspect that here the distinction between Carduchians and Kurds is discussed, but because both have the U ending vowel, instead scholars assert that here two different groups of the Carduchians are meant instead. Additionally, the 5th century Ibas, Archbishop of Edessa, had a disciple who almost certainly was Kurdish. His name was Moro Kurdoyo, but remarkably, in the Latin translation of the work, he is called Marai Carduensis. The 13th century Assyrian writer Bar Hebraius also refers to Beth Kardawaye being among the Roman conquests of Mesopotamia in 540. From the work The Monks of Mount Isla, we learn of Saint Chalito from the monastery of Mount Isla, which is the mountain north of Nusaybin. He wandered the lands crossing Beth Zabdai, and when he arrived in the village of Marnashaf, exorcised demons and converted the Kurds. In the Chronicle of Séert, we find one Rabban Shabur, who founded a convent in the mountains of Shushtar. Many people gathered around him, and he converted the neighboring Kurds. The same work mentions the 6th century Rabban bar Ita, a son of Mar Abraham, who went to the mountains of Marga, which is today's region of Acre in southern Kurdistan, accompanied by monks, and there he converted many Kurds and founded a monastery. Moreover, during the reign of the Ghassanid al-Harith in the 6th century, a place called Tel al-Qurdaye is mentioned near Damascus. And among the signatories of the Acts of the Synod of Ishoyab I in 585 was the Bishop Klilisho of Beth Tabiate and the Kartawaye. In the same work we find an early 7th century deacon called Margao Siso, said to be the son of the notables of the country of the Kardawaye. In the 6th and early 7th century there was also the Christian Ishoyal, perhaps the same person as mentioned before, who was born in Banu Hadra, which is Dohuk, studied in Tamanom, was a lecturer in Adiabene, and thereafter a monk active in Nisibis, before finally founding a convent in his native lands, in a place where the Kurds offer sacrifices to demons. Finally, in the histories of Rabban Hormizd the Persian and Rabban bar Ita, one finds the story of a devil appearing before a man in Beth Kartawaye, who threatened to destroy the whole village unless they would start worshipping the sun and sacrificed an ox. So these were the Syriac sources relevant for the Kurds in ancient times. Let's move on to the Greek and Latin ones for the ancient people of the Kurti. The Kurtians are generally considered to have first appeared in the 3rd century BC, mentioned by Polybius. During the rule of Antiochus III in 222 BC, Molon, the satrap of Media, revolted together with his brother, called Alexander, who ruled Persis. Antiochus III sent 2 generals who were crushed by Molon, but further occupied huge regions of Mesopotamia, Parapotamia, and Babylon, including the towns of Dura and Seleucia upon the Tigris. He proclaimed himself king, which is attested by coinage. Antiochus III then moved to meet Molon, who went towards Apollonides, and in this mountain region is where it's specified that he was to rely on his Kurtian slingers, and they fought in Apollonia, located near the Diala River. His army was crushed, however, after one wing of his troops betrayed him and went over to the other side. Molon could not hold out, fled, and fearing torture if he were taken alive, committed suicide. The rest of this account is no less gruesome. Molon's other brother, Neoleos, fled, killed his family, and then committed suicide after having convinced the 3rd brother, Alexander, to do the same. Polybius thereafter continues. After plundering the enemy's camp, the king ordered the body of Molon to be impaled on the most conspicuous spot in Media, which the men appointed to the work immediately did, for they took it to Colonides and impaled it close to the pass over Mount Zagros. And finally, among those who had been part of the rebel army, some were appointed as officers to guide the king's forces in mountainous Media. That among the turncoats were Kurtians appears confirmed when they then appear in the army of Antiochus III, participating at the Battle of Magnesia at Sipilum, close to today's Izmir or Smyrna, in 190 BC, mentioned by the Roman historian Livius. They were stationed at the outer sides of his flanks, a mixed force of 8,000 slingers and archers from the tribes of the Kurti and Elamites, 4,000 on the left, 4,000 on the right. 19 years later, they also served in the Roman army of Eumenes II in his battle against Perseus at Callinicus in Greece, as auxiliary forces for his cavalry. But we learn the most from the Greek historian from the 1st century BC, Strabo, who, while discussing Atropatene, states, "All regions of this country are fertile, except the part towards the north, which is mountainous and rugged and cold. The abode of the mountaineers called Cadusi, Amardi, Tapuri, Kurti, and other such peoples, who are migrants and predatory. For the Zagros and Euphrates mountains keep these tribes scattered, and the Kurti in Persis and the Mardi and those in Armenia who to this day are called by the same name are of the same character. When speaking of the tribes of Persia, he again specifies the Kurti and Mardian's brigandage. Finally, perhaps the 2nd century Ptolemy should also be considered, who states, "Towards the east, extending from the sources of the Tigris River, is Bagravandin, and below it Gordyene, east of which is Kotaya, and below it the Mardians." Some assert that Kotaya here should be corrected to Kortaya. By the way, in post-Islamic sources, such as in the Tactica of Leon, this became Kurtoy. In particular, make sure you have a large number of bows and arrows, for archery is a great and effective weapon against the peoples of the Saracens and the Kurds, who place their entire hope of victory in archery. Time to move on to the Armenian sources. Concerning the Armenian sources, scholars have asserted that the appearance of the Kurds must rather be sought in the appearance of toponyms in Gordyene that linguistically differ from it. Unfortunately, barring 1 or 2 exceptions, accounts of the term Kurds only seem to have popped up much later in Armenian sources. The toponyms include terms like Kordik, Kodrik, Kordrik, Korchek, and Korchaik. These initially designated the districts of the later Hakkari region. But remarkably, by the end of the ancient period, the entire former Gordyene region would be known as Korchaik, rendering Korduk, held to be a remnant of Gordyene, just as a district within it. Terms that are somewhat harder to place but appear related to Kurd are Kordovaci, Kordovit, Kordovaik, and Kortiank, mentioned by Akathangelos and the Pseudo-Kârnâmag, both of the 5th century. The region or district of Korchek is first mentioned in connection with the Armenian king Tigran, who ruled in the 1st century BC. This is preserved by Movses Khorenatsi, which makes it quite contentious. Though it's traditionally dated to the 5th century, is at times placed in the 8th or 9th century. The use of Korchek here therefore could be anachronistic. He states, concerning the establishment or origin of noble clans, that Tigran also established other minor clans, which were found here or in the region of Korchek. These were people of no importance because of the insignificance of their forces, but they had signaled themselves by their actions and had fought against the Greeks for the liberation. Part of them came from Korchek, and some from our side. They were from the close descendants of the original inhabitants, and from the family of the Haikids, and some were newcomers from outside. Among those clans, we also find the Kordovaci, among a few others that appear Iranic in origin. The history of Faustus concerns the 4th century. Kordik here either borders on or includes Sagamas, which is today's Salmas. Relevant events include that after Emperor Julian was defeated in 363 AD by the Persians, the unnamed ruler of Kordik left Armenia under King Arshak II and joined Persia. The Sparapet Mushek struck at the districts of Korduk, Kordik, and Tomorik, which had rebelled from the king of Armenia. He took captives and ruined the land, putting the remainder under taxation. Thereafter he did the same to the neighboring areas of the Medes, called Mark. Also, one Shahak Korchek became the head of the bishops for 2 years, after the death of his predecessor Zalven. It's also stated that the Sassanid commander Merujan left a detachment of troops in the Korchek district. And later there came a battle in this region, in which Merujan, with a doubtlessly heavily exaggerated 90,000 or 900,000 troops, was defeated by the Armenians of some 10,000, led by King Arshak. One particular manuscript on the Armenian saints Gregory and Narsai also include the Kurds in the highly diverse army of Shapur II, as he invaded Azerbaijan and Armenia in the 4th century. And Yegishe writes that Vasak of Siunik of the early 5th century committed all sorts of deceptive acts against the people living in the strongholds of Tomurik, Kordik, and other places. Furthermore, Kordik and Kodrik are also mentioned by Agathongelos. For the 6th century, the Armenian historian Sebios notes that in Kodrik, a certain presbyter by name of Abel was appointed to priestly rank in that land. He also relates the following interesting passage. There was in that country, by which is meant Hyrkania south of the Caspian Sea, a community deported from Armenia and settled on the edge of the great desert, which extends from Turkestan and Delhastan. They had forgotten their own language, lost the use of writing, and lacked the priestly order. There was also there a group of Kodrik, who had been taken captive with our own men, and furthermore not a few from the Greek Empire and from the region of Syria. The community of Kodrik were infidels, but over the Christians there shone a great light. They were confirmed in the faith and learned to speak and write their language. And the final Armenian source of the 7th century is the geography of Ananias of Chirac. It describes Korçayk as including the complete former Gordyene, as mentioned earlier. It included Upper, Middle, and Lower Kordik, as well as Korduk, and 7 other small districts called Chalk, Aydvank, Vorsirank, Aygark, Motolank, Kartunik, and Albak. Therefore, it seems to have been analogous with the Beth Kardawaye of the Syriacs. Time to move on to the Persian sources. This source is often regarded to be the oldest account of the term Kurd proper in Pahlavi. This is the Kârnâmag Ardashîr Babagân, compiled in the late Sassanid period, retelling the life story of Ardashîr I, who lived in the 3rd century AD. He battled one Madik, meaning the Mede, also called the Kurdan Shah, or King of the Kurds. Madik initially defeated Ardashîr I, and the latter had to retreat. He got lost and was helped by shepherds to find a large village where he could restock. Ardashîr I regrouped, prepared an army of 4,000 men, and surprised the Kurds, who thought he had returned to Parth, with a night attack. He killed 1,000 of them. Others were wounded, taken prisoner, and deported, and their possessions were plundered. Though the location is not specified, this is often assumed to have taken place in Media. This story is also preserved in the 11th century Shahnameh by Ferdowsi, who, however, changes this apparent battle for conquest into a punitive campaign, accusing the Kurds of thievery. The same work, the Kârnâmag, also asserts that Sasan, descendant of Darab, was the biological father of Ardashîr, and that during the reign of Alexander, he lived in distant lands, wandering with Kurdish shepherds. This probably forms the basis of one of the legends of origin of the band of thieves, the Banu Sasan, in Islamic times. Bizarrely, Tabari, who wrote in the 10th century, speaks of a derogatory letter sent by the Parthian king Ardavan to Ardashîr, telling him, "You have presumed beyond your rank in society, and have brought down on yourself destruction. O Kurds, brought up amongst the tents of the Kurds, who taught you to put a crown on your head?" In the Sasanian law book Matagdani Hazar Datastan from the early 7th century, it is mentioned that one Pusanve I Azat Martan ordained that the Kurds, or Martumi Kurds, when on their periodic migrations, are bound to the rules of the regions they pass through. And finally, in the presumably late 7th century Zoroastrian work, the Zandi Wahman Yasin, Ormazd, the great deity of Zoroastrianism, is quoted as having said, It is concerning the displayed banners and very numerous army, which were the armed men, champions, and soldiers from the countries of Iran at Padashkvargar, whom I told thee that they call both Kurd and Kârnâmag. It is declared that they will slay an excessive number in companionship and under the same banner for these countries of Iran. Those were the sources that I could gather that specifically mentioned the Kurds or related terms in an ancient context, though I probably missed out on some. However, there are also post-Islamic sources that detail semi-historical or even legendary and mythical accounts of the Kurds. One cannot take these at face value, of course. However, these give an indication that in the post-Islamic era, Kurds were deemed to have existed in the Near East since ancient times. A few examples are: the 10th century Hamza al-Isfahani notes that there were 7 cities of Ctesiphon in the Sassanid era. One of these has been read as either Kurdundats or Kurdabats, which of course would mean city of the Kurds. In the 11th century Persian Iskandarnama on Alexander the Great, the Kurds are mentioned as having kidnapped and sold the Yemenite king Tahtash when he was young. It is narrated in the following way. My father took me and my brother in his arms and left. In the meantime, a big flood emerged. My father left me on one side of the river in order to carry my brother from one bank of the river to the other side. Then he would come to carry me too. Suddenly, Kurd horsemen appeared and abducted me. After 10 years, they sold me to this king. The 9th century Dinawari, perhaps Kurdish himself, mentions Media as the pastures of the Kurds. He is also the first to mention the story of Kurds being descended from 2 men who escaped from Dahak. They say every day he brought 4 stout men, and they were slaughtered and their brains were taken, and the 2 snakes were fed with them. He had a vizier from among his folk, and he put in charge of his ministry a man from the sons of Arvashat, who was called Armiyail. When he brought the men to be slaughtered, he spared the life of 2 of them, and put in their stead 2 rams. And he ordered the men to go where there would be no trace of them. They went into the mountains, and they stayed in them and did not come near villages or cities. It is said that they were the origin of the Kurds. Furthermore, according to Dinawari, the child of Afrasiab with the sister of Siyavush grew up among the Kurds in the mountains. He also narrates the story of Sasan dwelling among the Kurds. Additionally, he also mentions one Gordyene, nephew of Bahram Shobin, the 6th century Parthian descended ruler of the Sassanid Empire, as well as Bahram's sister called Kurdiya. In some Islamic sources, the same Bahram Shobin is mentioned as Bahram Kurdi or Kurdi, and Sharaf Khan even asserts that he was Kurdish. He does the same as some other classical authors do for the legendary Rostami Kurt and even Bokhtul Nasr, the Assyrian king, which may sound absurd, though he did in fact marry a Median woman and had been woven into Iranic mythology at large. The Kalhur in the Sharafnama are asserted to be among his descendants. Also interesting to note is that the town Share-Kurt was mentioned as Share-Kurt in pre-Islamic times, meaning the city of bravery. In the Georgian Chronicles, the Kurds are said to be descended from deportees, after the Georgian-Sassanid alliance had conquered Abasheti in the 5th century. Strictly speaking, this toponym referred to Ethiopia, but it could in fact refer to any southern or eastern land from the Georgian perspective. Multiple Islamic sources also noted that the villain that suggested that Abraham had to be thrown on the pyre was a Kurd called Hayzan. And finally, the 17th century Evliya Celebi relates the following story. According to the chronicler Mekdisi, the first town to be built after Noah's flood was the town of Judi, followed by the fortresses of Sinjar and Mefarqin. The town of Judi was ruled by Malik Kurdim of the Prophet Noah's community, a man who lived no less than 600 years and who traveled the length and width of Kurdistan. Coming to Mefarqin, he liked its climate and settled there, begetting many children and descendants. He invented a language of his own, independent of Hebrew. It is neither Hebrew nor Arabic, Persian, Dari, or Pahlavi. They still call it the language of Kurdim. So the Kurdish language, which was invented in Mefarqim and is now used throughout Kurdistan, owes its name to Melik Kurdim of the community of the Prophet Noah. Because Kurdistan is an endless stony stretch of mountains, there are no less than 12 varieties of Kurdish, differing from one another in pronunciation and vocabulary, so that they often have to use interpreters to understand one another's words. In this video, I wish to present some of the accounts of the Kurds in the pre-Islamic periods, taking into account that these are not representative of the Kurds' ancestors as a whole. Let's nonetheless try to merge the information we have seen. The Kurds inhabited Greater Media and northern Mesopotamia, and were also present in southern Iran. Most accounts happen in Korçayk or Gordyene and neighboring areas. The discussed Kurds, who, judging by geography, appear to more so represent the Kurmanji speakers, are mentioned quite early in the Zagros and Ifedis mountains, but also at today's Hamrin mountains. They may have originated from Atropatene, said to particularly inhabit its northern mountains. From here, they must have migrated to Sagamas, which is Salmas, Elbak, Kordik, Mount Qardu, Gazarta, or Jazira Botan, Marga or Accra, and adjoining regions. Putting a date on this migration is still very hard, but it's clear that the Indo-Iranians had spread far into Mesopotamia and beyond, well before the dawn of Islam. They were warlike, nomadic brigands, a few times mentioned together with the Mardians. Kurds were generally characterized as mountaineers, pagans, as semi-nomadic pastoralists, and as warlike. Religiously, they appear Indo-Iranian, but many conversions to Christianity took place, generally proselytized by individuals of the Assyrian Church. For the sources, check the description. Until next time, when I hope to discuss the Kurds in early Islamic times.